He left billions to his maid. The headline on my phone read, the words slick and enormous on a screen that still felt too bright for the dim room where I sat, draped in black. A small brass key lay on the coffee table beside it, an old thing with a patina like a memory. The lawyer had set it there when he folded the envelope closed after the funeral. No fanfare, only the thin shuffle of paper in a room that had known better days. He cleared his throat and said, with the solemnity of someone who had been given instructions he did not relish delivering, "There are a few surprises in the estate. Mr. Mitchell wanted them handled carefully." Surprises? The word felt brittle in my mouth. Joshua had always liked to be careful. He liked plans drawn on the backs of envelopes and little contingencies taped under drawers. I had married a man who saw the world in checklists and quiet assurances. He would have hated the spectacle the headline promised. He would have hated that the first thing anyone thought about him now was a sensational caption rather than the sound of the horses at dawn or the way he used to fidget with paint-stained rags while he talked. The envelope held 3 things: a deed to Maple Creek Farm, a sealed letter addressed to me in a handwriting I knew as well as my own pulse, and a small note from Joshua. Nothing long, just a sentence that felt like a hand on my shoulder. "Do not open everything at once," it said. "You will need breath." A lawyer's taste for understatement met my grief in that room. He told me the farm had been purchased in secret 2 years earlier, that Joshua had insisted on property managers and a shell company to shield the purchase from public notice. He told me very quietly that surveys had recently suggested a significant geological formation under the west 10 acres. It could be economically valuable, he said, and left the rest of the sentence in the air because placing a word like vast in a probate meeting would have seemed both tasteless and dangerous. I left the law office with the key in my palm and a hollow in my chest that no amount of arranging flowers could fill. Jenna sat beside me in the car. She was 12 then, older than her years and younger than the things she had to carry. She had a face like Joshua, soft around the brow, stubborn in the jaw. She took the key from my hand without a word, thumbed it, and slid it back into the pocket of her coat as if hiding it from the world might make it safer. People assume funerals end in absolutes: the casket closed, the last hymn song, the moment when the world snaps back into an order that does not include the missing person. But grief is not a punctuation mark. It is a series of interruptions. 2 days after the funeral, the interruptions came in the form of a knock at the front door, heavy and insistent. By then, the house at Maple Creek Farm had become less a home and more an archive of a life. There were canvases draped and propped against walls, brushes rinsed and left to dry, the smell of oil paint still in the studio like an exhaled confession. The farm itself was a wound of green and wood. The horses pressed their noses against each other in the paddock, as if forming a small conspiratorial circle. Ellis met us at the gate, boots dusted with the fine loam from the tracks. He had been with Joshua for 10 years. He knew the names of each mare and the peculiarities of every fence post. When he saw me, he lowered his head in a gesture that called something older than protocol. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, and the steadiness in his voice was a support beam. Behind him, the barns and the main house argued with the late autumn sky. There was a whisper of evidence in the way he watched the property, protective, reverent. He had been Joshua's right hand, in the way a lighthouse is a keeper's companion. Not given to grand acts, but central to everything that stays upright. The knock was from the brothers. Robert was first, as always, broad shoulders, an expression cut from a cloth I had seen since childhood, indignant and practiced. Alan followed with legal polish and a professional smile that never quite reached his eyes. David trailed, more quiet than the others, but his silence had a way of amplifying the things he did not say.
They hovered at the edge of the drive, as if the gate itself could be contested territory. They did not come in as brothers. They came in as claimants. Within an hour, a man with a badge from the provincial constabulary had walked the perimeter, asked a few curt questions, and left a card. The first conversation was not with a judge or a jury, but with a man who thought the farmer's business could be contained in a notebook. He was wrong. The brothers had heard the rumor like everyone else, the scraped-together word that there might be money under the soil. It gave them a thing to hold on to while everything else floated away. They asked for a reading of the will. They brandished an offer thinly disguised as concern. "It would make sense to settle quietly," Robert said. "You can't manage a property like this alone, Kathy. Let common sense prevail." Common sense in their mouths was a white flag. They saw land as ledger entries, assets they had a right to claim. What they did not see, what their spreadsheets could not encompass, was the collection of small, quiet truths Joshua had been stockpiling for years. A stack of videos, a sealed bunker, an accountant with instructions to call certain people only under specific circumstances. He had been living with a clock in him and a plan he would not let the world rewrite. On the kitchen table, under the mug with his initials that someone had left on the counter, was a laptop with a sticky note in Joshua's handwriting. For Catherine, 1 a day. I remember the way my fingers paused above the trackpad, as if touching it could start a series of dominoes.
He had always used technology like a mason uses mortar. Clean lines, secure connections. Opening the folder was like stepping through a door he had left ajar. The first video he labeled Day 1. He was older than the man who painted in the evenings, older than the man who laughed with his elbows on the table. He sat in his studio with light falling across his hands. He looked at the camera like he was looking at me. "If you're watching," he said, voice even, "it's because I didn't get to finish explaining everything in breakfast." There was a flicker of a smile that made my throat tighten. He always did that, insisted on light where the world tried to be heavy. "I bought the farm back," he continued, and the sentence landed like a stone. "Not just as a place to live. I bought it to hold something for us, for Jenna, for anyone who needed a home after we're gone." He folded his hands. "And I set aside things that matter more than money." He never used the word Maid. He never used the word billions. Those words arrived later in other mouths. What Joshua did do was lay out in meticulous short paragraphs a map of responsibilities. He spoke about stewardship and about who he trusted to run the stables and to be near the child who would inherit more than ledger lines. He spoke in a way that assumed trust is an asset you can bequeath as surely as a deed. Towards the end of the tape, he said something simple and utterly Joshua. "If you can't forgive me for the way I kept things, then forgive me for the faults in my keeping. But know why I did it. Know who I wanted near the horses in the paint when you needed someone steady." Later that day, the brothers watched the same tape in their own way, through the lens of entitlement. They found a clause in the will that named Ellis, not in a token way, but as a primary caretaker with a specified allocation. Not an amount in exact numerals, but a direction that placed Ellis in a position to manage the farm and to receive a substantial share of the estate to ensure continuity of care. Substantial became a gaping word in their mouths that they turned into demands. The rumor mill goes from whisper to roar with only one ingredient, a face. Someone filmed a part of the exchange, the brothers outside the gate, hands in pockets, voices raised in the kind of argument that makes neighbors take sides. The security camera above the drive caught Robert's hand slapping the car as he leaned into the window, Alan's precise jawline as he made his case, and David's face, which did not move much but trembled at the corners. That footage moved like a piece of electricity through the family graph, Phones lit up and replies came chained in anger. Caught on tape, the brothers' indignation lost the sheen of argument and acquired the rough texture of performance. Shouts in the wind, a ring of supporters with eyes that wanted to see blood in the ledger. The video was grainy, time-stamped, mundane in its quality, but that was what made it viciously truthful. It showed them unguarded. It showed them believing they had claim by birthright. It did not, however, show what Joshua had been doing with his knights and his secretaries and his maps. "Why Ellis?" Jenna asked me one night as we sat in the studio, the canvases leaning like resting beasts. She had heard the whispers from school. The questions that suggested poverty and salvation were one and the same. She looked at me as if looking might rearrange the world into a kinder shape. "He's been here forever," I said. It sounded thin. The truth was larger and fuller. Ellis had been there when Joshua painted lines until dawn, when he tacked new canvases on the wall to dry, when he tucked Jenna under a blanket with a story for her that wasn't mine, but made my chest ache with gratitude. Ellis had been steady in a family that valued movable assets more than constancy. Joshua wanted constancy rewarded. There was something else, always is, nestled among the deeds in the late-night instructions. Tucked at the back of the barn was a trapdoor. It was the sort of thing you felt in your foot before you saw. A depression in the floorboards, a seam that sang when you ran your palm along it. Joshua had liked secret things, but not for show. His secrets were practical, like a spare key under a coat. When the trapdoor opened, it released a smell of earth and oil, metal, dust, and a faint mineral tang that was not yet fame, but the potential for it. The room beneath the barn felt like someone's truth made physical. Shelves held folders with labels, bound in Joshua's clean hand. Geological Survey, West 10 Acres. Contracts, interim, oil firms. Maps, 2019-2022. A plywood desk bore a lamp and a set of prints that, when spread, showed the kind of lines I'd seen on canvas, but with a different logic. Cross-sections of earth, shaded strata, markers where core samples had been taken. There were numbers there, not of currency, but of depth and estimate. Porosity, pressure, a language that promised potential beneath the soil. I have never been a woman who reads maps without hands-on assistance. I had learned to appreciate shading and color, but not the taxonomy of rock. But even I could see the point. Someone had spent real money and real time to know what lay beneath our land. And someone had, in great foresight, kept those documents in a place that would confound anyone who came only to make a claim. Joshua had been deliberate in the way people who expect storms to arrive are deliberate. Sandbags in place, photographs tucked in plastic. What the maps did not show, and what the folded letters did, was a long list of people Joshua trusted and why. Names were followed by parentheses of reason, caretaking capability, loyalty, knowledge of horses. There, in a thin column, was Ellis's name with a note. Hands, knows how to hold what should not be broken. Beside the legal attachment that assigned authority to manage the agricultural operations and negotiate any resource agreements, someone, Joshua, had written in neat, affable script, "Stewardship over profit. Do not let numbers be the only argument. Preserve land, life, craft." When the brothers found the trapdoor, they saw everything differently. They saw a box of evidence in which motive and method were convenient tools. Alan, with his suit and his lawyer smile still ironed into place, scanned the folders with a look that would have been familiar to any man who had learned to see people as parts of a transaction. He leafed through a contract that outlined ways to negotiate with industry, stipulations to protect water tables and limit surface disturbance, clauses about royalties and staged extraction that read like someone who had tried to hold two opposing impulses at bay: the need to honor land and the reality of market forces. Why would he do this? Robert barked into the open air of the barn. Why give control to someone who isn't family? This is our blood on this land. Family doesn't always mean steward, I said, and tasted the defensiveness in my voice. I had said things in the past I had come to regret. I learned quickly that my voice had to be careful in ways I had not imagined before. Joshua went quiet. But there was a coldness in their words I had not felt when Joshua was alive, the way that dead liberate people to behave as if no one will record them. They did record themselves, of course, phones out, comments that would be sharpened into accusations later, short clips of them in the barn gesturing at maps like men who had a prior right to interpret the world. Later, someone sent me a clip where Robert, flushed with certainty, declared the will ambiguous and subject to challenge. The timestamp on the bottom of the clip read 10:42 a.m., October the 9th. The court of public opinion does not require a judge. Caught on tape, the brothers had become both actors and audience to their own indignation. Their faces were visible in grainy feeds, the popped vein in Robert's neck when he raised his voice, the calculated pauses Alan took between sentences as if someone had stuffed legal jargon between his teeth. David's eyes that seemed to drift toward the trapdoor with the kind of hunger I had only seen before in men reading stock tickers. But the trapdoor hid more than contracts. In a false-bottomed chest, I found a sealed letter, its edges browned with deliberate handling. It was addressed to me. I carried it back into the house like a superstitious person cradling a relic, afraid that air would unspool whatever secret it contained. Joshua's pen had the same neat pressure I remembered. He never wrote anything he did not mean to be read. The letter was not long. He wrote as if speaking across a table at breakfast, punctuated with small jokes only I would understand. He described how he had known for some seasons that his time on Earth might be truer to the maps than to the calendar. He apologized for secrecy without self-pity and explained his reasons: to shelter the animals, to guarantee that Jenna would have a childhood not negotiated by men who saw children as assets, to make sure there would be someone who could look after the horses without them being sold off to the highest bidder. I know giving Ellis this responsibility will anger some, he wrote, but it will also spare you from the day-to-day fight over numbers. He does not think in percentages. He thinks in hoofbeats. Let him be the one who keeps the gate closed when you need it closed. His handwriting trembled at the last line. It read, "If you must fight, fight like someone who wants the land to keep breathing after we are gone." There is a kind of fury that takes a long time to form. For me, it was like water widening a crack. Grief made things like cracks. It opened places that had been sealed with familiarity. The discovery of the maps and the sealed letter widened a fissure that ran between me and the brothers. What had once been a family quarrel was now charged with the weight of what Joshua had chosen to protect. The calls began the next morning. Local reporters sniffed around like dogs following scent. Friends split into camps, the social media echo chamber, where strangers adjudicated private decisions, threw the brothers into hero roles and me into a villain depending on which headline stuck. There was a clip, short and vicious, of Robert standing outside the house promising to take this to court while shaking his fist in a direction that suggested the ledger rather than the heavens. But what the videos and the trap door and the maps had not revealed yet was the full architecture of Joshua's plan. The laptop continued to offer answers as long as I was prepared to watch. Each video was a small lesson: how to read a clause, who to call and in what order, who could be trusted with confidentiality, who must never be offered leverage. There were also smaller things: where he had hidden certain paintings that he had painted for no one but me, which of the mares preferred a particular kind of blanket, how to coax Jenna to tell the truth when she felt pressured. On the 5th day, I sat down and watched 3 videos back to back, the afternoon slipping past like a silent tear. Joshua's voice walked me through the details of a meeting plan he had drafted in case the brothers made legal moves or invited public scrutiny. He had thought of cameras. He had thought of witnesses. He had written names of people who, if they were called, could speak to the chain of custody for the maps, to the payments that had been made to the surveyors, to the fact that the purchase had been completed with funds from accounts that were legal and traceable, but deliberately anonymized to protect a process he was trying to keep simple for those he loved. "And if they try to make this ugly," he said on the last tape I watched that day, looking straight at the camera as if he were in my kitchen across the table, "remember that sometimes truth shows up like a slow light. It doesn't need to be loud to be clear." I replayed that sentence until it felt like armor. In the margins of some of the folders in the bunker, there were notes he had made about potential negotiations. A clause that would require any extraction agreement to include environmental mitigations. A stipulation that a percentage of any revenue be directed to a fund for the care of horses and for Jenna's education. He had not just thought about wealth, he had thought about its consequences. There is a moral complexity to inheriting stewardship. Money, especially the sort that comes attached to a possibility beneath the ground, demands decisions about doing no harm while doing what is necessary. Joshua had tried to write the morality into the paperwork. He had tried, in the careful strokes of his pen, to make responsibility greater than profit. Still, the brothers smelled opportunity. They talked about lawsuits as if they were mere tools to leverage a better deal. Alan spoke in legal hypotheticals that made his eyes glitter with a certain feral delight. He enjoyed the game. Robert negotiated in the language of ownership, as if being first to the worst possible outcome guaranteed moral superiority. If anything, the presence of the brothers galvanized the community into two camps: those who saw Ellis as the loyal steward chosen by a man who knew his people, and those who saw the decision as a scandal to be rectified. Caught on tape, again. There was a grainy clip of Alan and Robert confronting Ellis in the yard, Alan's voice low and precise. Ellis stood like the heel of something unshakable. His reply was a quiet refusal, not of law, but of a surrender he did not recognize. He spoke of horses and fences and the small, patient work of care. Ellis's presence made the argument about more than money. It transported it into territory the brothers had no claim to. Jenna began to withdraw from people who wanted to take her side, as if a childhood could be too crowded with opinions. I watched her retreat into sketches and notebooks, hearing her develop a vocabulary for the things she wanted to hold: a mare named Lark, a studio that smelled of linseed, a future that did not pressure her into choosing between relatives and self. She trusted Ellis in a way she could not be expected to trust anyone else yet. Joshua had known this. The town started whispering about billions. The economic language of resource extraction has its own alchemy. Estimations become headlines, and estimations crystallize into public claims. I found myself explaining at coffee shops and at meetings with potential counsel that the figure, if it could be called that, was a projection, not a bank balance. Projections can be life-changing. They can also be dangerous when people take them as permission to act without ethics. In the afternoons, I returned to the studio and painted. I had not painted much since Joshua's diagnosis. The brush felt foreign and intimate at once. My hand moved in the way something healing learns to move, slowly, with intent. I painted a horse the exact color of the mare that rested by the fence, and a field that seemed both infinite and contained. In one corner of the canvas, there was a tiny gate, and just beyond it, a figure with a brass key in a pocket, an image that felt less like literal representation and more like a prayer. Late in the week, a new video appeared on the laptop that I had not seen before. It was not labeled Day X. It was simply named For the Meeting. My chest went cold with an anticipation that felt almost like fear. Joshua sat at the same chair, the light wrapped around his shoulders like a shawl. He held a sealed envelope in his hand,
and looked directly into the lens. "If you ever have to show people what I kept," he said, and there was a gravity in his voice I had not heard before, "show them the whole picture. Don't let pieces be dramatic on their own. Let them be part of the whole." He leaned forward. "There will be cameras in the dining room. There will be voices. If you need me, tell them I loved them once. Tell them I wanted them to keep the horses. Tell them you are not making this about old scores." He paused, and for the first time in all the videos that had been a map and a manual and a lover's letter, his eyes blurred. "Bring an expert," he said finally. "Bring someone who understands the maps and someone who knows how the land breathes. And if you must show them my reasons, show them the files in the bunker. Let them see that I did not act on whim." I turned the laptop off with my hand small and shaking. Outside, beyond the studio windows, a horse walked along the fence line, tail flicking, the sound like a metronome marking a new tempo for life. Inside, the house hummed with the accumulated objects of a man who had tried to think of tomorrow the way people pack lunches for no one else to see. The meeting Joshua anticipated had not yet happened. The brothers had cornered us twice in the weeks since the funeral, each conversation more slicing than the last. They had called in people who wore the calm of the courthouse like armor. They had said words that implied that the designation of Ellis was an affront to blood. I had learned the dangerous thing about grief. It erodes the borders people use to protect what they care about. Some men saw an opening and thought it a mandate. As the days folded into one another, more cameras appeared, people filming on footpaths, in the lane by the barn, capturing moments that would later be framed as evidence or proof of bad intent.
The security footage compiled like a chorus of small witnesses. A brother's fist on a gate, a whispered phone call at dusk, a tilt of the head that betrayed plans. Through it all, Jenna retreated into the studio, where colors could be trusted more than voices. I knew I could react with fury. I knew I could let their claims go to the kind of public peak that leaves companies hungry and lives wrecked. But watching Joshua's tapes was a lesson in method and a prayer for restraint. He had not wanted revenge. He wanted protection and reason. He had expected the worst and planned for it as another kind of tenderness. The thing a widow learns fast is where her strength lives. For me, it lived in the slow accretion of small wins. A phone call to a surveyor who confirmed dates. A chat with an environmental consultant who promised to be guided by law and conscience. The presence of Ellis who refused to be cowed. I began to stitch together a plan, not of confrontation for its own sake, but of revelation. A way to show the whole picture at once, so that the brothers' claims would look performative beside the breadth of documentation Joshua had left. There was a risk, of course, that secrets displayed could be used against the very thing they were meant to protect. Joshua had known this. He had filmed instructions that were meticulous about chain of custody and witness presence. He had asked on one tape that certain people be present for certain calls and that certain conversations be recorded for the sake of clarity, not drama. I put a list together by hand, the names he had included, the expert he had suggested, the attorney I could trust not to be dazzled by headline numbers. I wrote it on a sheet of paper and folded it into the notebook where I kept the contact information for people who would matter. There was comfort in the ledger of names. It felt like a map drawn in human ink. And then, one afternoon, as the sky dropped the light like an offering, Alan called Jenna. He called with an offer and with a tone that smelled of guilt wrapped in entitlement. He said the words no parent should hear, that he would help, that he would ensure her future. He made it sound like a kindness. He promised safety if she would stand with them. Her voice on the phone cracked like a small thing breaking. "Why would I have to choose?" she said softly, the children's sketches scattered on the work table behind her. "Why would I have to pick who looks like me?" There was a silence that could have been the end of everything.
I put down the brush and walked into the hallway, pressing my hand to the wood as if the grain itself could lend me courage. I thought about the letters Joshua had written, the maps he had signed, the care clause he had insisted upon. I thought about the stipulations that tied stewardship to ethics.
When I left the studio that evening, the barn had been lit in that kind of small theater glow that makes faces look like relief maps, anyone's features exaggerated and made more legible. Ellis stood in the doorway, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He looked at me with that quiet steadiness and said simply, "He told you the truth, Mrs. Mitchell. He knew they'd come for what he built. We'll need the files and witnesses, and to be ready." The word ready sounded less like preparation than distinction. It meant that Joshua's plan was beginning to be acted on. It meant that the moment the brothers had been priming themselves for, the moment of contest and public claim, was coming closer. It meant, too, that cameras would be present, that the brothers' reactions would probably be caught on tape in better quality than the handheld clips that had been making rounds. There is an odd kind of peace when you choose to meet the world with evidence instead of accusation. It is not a clean peace. It is threaded with the knowledge that people you love will be heard even as truth is aired. But it is steadier than rage, steadier than indecision. I found a rhythm in preparing the room where the meeting would happen, the dining room with its long table, the chair footprints Joshua preferred, the portrait he had once painted of us standing by the northern oak. At the edge of that preparation, I found a different kind of note from Joshua. No camera, just a thin card tucked into the envelope he had told me not to open all at once. It had one sentence: "When the cameras are rolling, remember to breathe. Speak like you want the land to hear you." I laid the card down, folded my hands, and looked out the window at the field where a single horse grazed near the line of trees. The horizon was a blade of silver and possibility. The brothers' faces were already lined into the film of the town's gossip. Their recorded moments were out there, ugly and small. But below the soil, in the quiet strata of rock and distance, the maps held a promise that was not only of wealth, but of work to do and responsibility to fulfill. The meeting had not yet been called. The dining room table remained empty, but the trapdoor had been found, the laptop had been opened, the videos had called me into a role I had not expected to play. And in the hush that comes just before the world clicks into motion, I felt something I had not felt since Joshua's breath had become an absence, a possibility that the life he had tried to protect could endure. I turned the key in my palm once more, feeling its weight, and set it down on the table. Then I began to make the calls he had taught me to make. I began calling the names Joshua had left me, the way someone reciting a list of lifelines. Each person he had asked for was a particular kind of anchor. The surveyor, who could explain porosity in plain terms. The environmental consultant, who could translate legalese into riverways and aquifers. The lawyer, who would not be dazzled by projected numbers. I made the calls in the order he had preferred and with the care he had insisted upon. I read his notes aloud sometimes, as if the cadence of his hand could steady my own. Before the meeting, there was the practical choreography of it all. Ellis and I walked the rooms where cameras should point, not to hunt the brothers, but to make sure nothing could be taken out of context. The dining table had been cleared, Joshua's prints flanked the north wall, and the portrait he'd painted of us by the oak watched everything with an even, forgiving eye. Jenna sat near the studio doorway with a sketchbook, shading a mare's flank with a concentration I had come to rely on as a sign she was coping in her own quiet way. "If you like twists like this, hit subscribe," I said then, feeling absurd and strangely brave, because there are moments when the world needs not only witnesses, but an audience that will hold you accountable to the truth you tell. The words were an odd beat in the small domestic symphony, a digital request tucked between the tilt of a lamp and the creak of the chair. The experts arrived like a weather front. Dr. Miriam Hale, a geologist whose name Joshua had written in block letters on the back of an envelope, came with a leather satchel full of charts and an even steadier voice. She spoke into the room as if translating the earth into sentences that could be trusted in courtrooms or around kitchen tables. She was followed by a woman from a conservation trust who had spent a lifetime arguing that wealth built from the ground should not mean foregoing the ground itself. Joshua had been exact about this. He had not wanted a single decision made under the sway of temptation. Each expert was a line he'd drawn in the sand, someone for the maps, someone for the law, someone for the horses. I watched them set up, arranging papers like petals, and felt the odd relief of having other people anchor the facts. Alan and Robert arrived late, as if time had moral weight that could be bent to their convenience. Alan's tie wore firmness like armor. Robert's voice carried the same arrogance I had heard since childhood. David came after them with a face buffered by indecision. The brothers moved through the house as if they expected their blood to rearrange the furniture. They complained first, as an opening gambit, that Joshua's secrecy had confused ownership, that the anonymized purchase left things open to interpretation, that a caretaker could not, by birthright, hold real authority over what had always been called Mitchell land. Their words were practiced, their gestures were meant to imply inevitability. It is exhausting to watch people who have been schooled in entitlement perform certainty. I had taken Joshua's advice seriously. Cameras set to record, witnesses in place, and an expert at the end of the table prepared to speak about the land and its potential in terms that would not be fallible to shouting. When the meeting began, I invited Dr. Hale to explain the surveys. She spoke softly, then with a quiet authority, about what the core sample suggested, porous strata, and signs that suggested a formation of interest. She did not promise fortunes or measure worth in currency. She explained geological probability, rates of extraction complexity, the environmental contingencies that would make any project costly if done carefully. There is potential, she said plainly. There is also responsibility. That word, responsibility, hung between us like a bell. Joshua had written it into the very clauses that bound any extraction. He had bargained with foresight and what was, to him, moral non-negotiables: protections for the water table, staged extraction, and a fund for the animals and the child who would inherit more than ledgers. I laid the printed pages from the bunker on the table. They were not dramatic on their own. Stamped survey numbers, receipts to verify payments to technicians, emails threaded with dates and names. Alan leaned forward, scanning the dates as if he could find a flaw in chronology and create chaos by sheer will. Robert's jaw worked like a machine re-oiling itself with rumor. "You'll forgive the bureaucratic detail," I said, "but this is where intent meets action." Then I did what Joshua had asked, what he had advised me to do when the cameras rolled. I spoke plainly about why Ellis had been placed where he was in the will. I told them, without rancor, that Joshua had trusted hands more than ledger lines, that the horses needed someone who kept the fences mended even when no one was watching, that Jenna needed constancy. I did not speak to win or to humiliate. I spoke to be clear. As I talked, a grainy clip that had been seeded online months earlier, the one showing Robert and Alan at the gate, stuttered across a phone someone had set on speaker at the end of the table. I had not cued it. It played anyway. Robert's hand banging on the car, Alan's precise phrasing, David's face an unreadable map. The timestamps and angles made it feel less like performance and more like an unedited testament. The room shifted. The brothers did not like being made small by their own footage. "What you're seeing there," Dr. Hale said, pointing gently, "is the problem of private leadership being turned public. If we govern these decisions quietly, without standards, the land would lose its right to breathe. Mr. Mitchell's documents insist on a set of protections that anybody who negotiates extraction must accept." Alan objected, of course. He pointed to a clause that he insisted was vague and suggested that ambiguity meant the court would have to decide, that probate could undo a careful allocation. He used phrases like precedent and ambiguity as if they were hammers ready to break the quiet structures Joshua built. But Joshua had foreseen argument. He had not trusted the sincerity of men to steady the ship by themselves, so he had chosen method. Chain of custody documents, notarized payments, recorded instructions that mapped the timeline of the purchase, and, crucially, the sealed letter that addressed a potential moral ploy I had not wished to imagine. When Alan, with the subtlety of a man who enjoys the leverage of inquisition, suggested that there might be a medical issue a relative required support for, and that the family had a moral duty to prioritize direct kin, well, it was the kind of appeal that smells like water to someone thirsty. He used the language of care to demand advantage. The suggestion was thinly veiled. Perhaps Jenna should be tested for donation compatibility. Perhaps a family bloodline should take precedent in decisions. Perhaps by invoking a hypothetical illness, he might reframe moral responsibility into legal leverage. I read the relevant excerpt aloud, feeling the strange intimacy of hearing his handwriting become a reproach and a comfort in the mouths of other people. If anyone raises the specter of health as a tool to leverage my choices, refer them to the clinic arrangements. Get independent counsel. No young person should be asked to choose under duress. Joshua's sentence was a small, fierce law. Alan happened to be the sort of man who believes that legal wrangling is both sport and art. He bristled. Robert, who loved the visceral theater of showier complaints, made a face like someone denied a feast. David looked away, but his hand trembled when he reached for his phone. The stylistic contrast in their reactions was a kind of truth. Entitlement wears different faces, but it recognizes its own injured tone wherever it finds it. That moment, when a procedural check turned a manipulative suggestion into an ethical one, was important. It removed the subject from the realm of moral ambiguity and placed it squarely into the domain of standards. Independent medical counsel, documented consent, funding for alternatives. The brothers' attempt to harness compassion as leverage was bluntly neutralized by the very documents Joshua had left. And then there was something else Joshua had anticipated. The way men like Alan and Robert will test not only documents, but people. They tried another tack, public performance. Robert stepped toward the edge of the table with the kind of showmanship that makes a small town meet the spectacle of a soap opera. "You expect us to accept this," he said loudly, and the room's microphones caught the thrust of his accusation. "Because you got sentimental about a stable hand? Because you preferred loyalty over blood?" The cameras recorded everything. Table microphones, a discreet ring camera at the ceiling, Dr. Hale's phone with its own timestamp. The brothers' faces, in their unassumed ugliness, were being preserved in several formats. It made the moment less about rhetoric and more about accountability. The difference between spoken words and the archives that captured them is that archives do not let you recast yourself later. They preserve the rawness. They save us from convenient memory. I did not want the meeting to be ugly. Joshua had asked for gentleness and for the truth to be shown whole. I tried to keep my voice gentle. "No one here is immune to grief," I said, "but grief cannot be a weapon. These documents show why he wanted stewardship in the hands of someone who understands the land, who knows the horses. They show his care for Jenna. They show his attempt to make sure money would not erase a life that had steadiness in it." It was not dramatic enough for some. Robert made a sudden, sharp gesture at the papers. David stood as if he had been pulled by a string. Alan, who had been circling in an intellectual way, decided then to threaten legal action, to stress the ambiguities. He made a point of how courts loved to unravel tangled instructions. He suggested that probate would make the final say. "We're not naive," he said. "We know how courts operate. Ambiguity invites contest. It would be irresponsible of us not to examine every clause."
We had been ready for the suggestion of litigation. Joshua had left a list of things to document and people to call. The trick was to make ambiguity less useful as a weapon. Dr. Hale went over the chain of custody that proved the purchase had been completed with funds that, though anonymized in the account, could be traced by date and signature. The surveyor who had been paid as an intermediary was on the phone in a moment. She confirmed dates and procedures. Our lawyer, Mrs. Winters, read aloud utilizations that had been done precisely because Joshua wanted clarity if his plan ever met a storm. It was not dramatic enough for some. Robert made a sudden, sharp gesture at the papers. David stood as if he had been pulled by a string. Alan, who had been circling in an intellectual way, decided then to threaten legal action to stress the ambiguities. He made a point of how courts loved to unravel tangled instructions. He suggested that probate would make the final say. "We're not naive," he said. "We know how courts operate. Ambiguity invites contest. It would be irresponsible of us not to examine every clause." We had been ready for the suggestion of litigation. Joshua had left a list of things to document and people to call. The trick was to make ambiguity less useful as a weapon. Dr. Hale went over the chain of custody that proved the purchase had been completed with funds that, though anonymized in the account, could be traced by date and signature. The surveyor who had been paid as an intermediary was on the phone in a moment. She confirmed dates and procedures. Our lawyer, Mrs. Winters, read aloud notarizations that had been done precisely because Joshua wanted clarity if his plan ever met a storm.
"It may be contested," she said quietly, "but it is not without predicate. Mr. Mitchell did exactly the work required to make his intent clear." Alan, whose business was the delicious friction of legal possibilities, did what he did best. He stepped back, touched his chin, and said he would review the documents and discuss the options. The use of the word review is an old lawyer's habit of reminding people that a process exists to strip momentum from outrage. But there is a limit to legerdemain. When you face a room that includes expert testimony, chain of custody documentation, notarized payments, and the very person you are accusing of secrecy recorded explaining his decisions, the theater of litigation loses its shine. Outside, someone had posted another clip, a time-stamped camera that had captured Robert on his way out of the barn, muttering something that, when played slowly, was not persuasive but sharp. The internet stitched the footage into a thread of indignation and hungry commentary. People choose sides quickly when a story smells like money. There were viewers who sympathized with the brothers. There were those who, without ever knowing the full context, stood with a woman who had grieved. As the afternoon moved toward a conclusion, Alan suggested mediation instead of drawn-out litigation. He was willing to accept a structured negotiation if, of course, the settlement reflected his notion of fairness. The brothers wanted terms that would let them exercise influence. It was a familiar tactic. Propose a compromise that seems reasonable, but only when you've tested the limits of negotiation. But Joshua had written guardrails into the possibility of settlement. He had specified that any agreement had to preserve stewardship and the environmental clauses intact. Extraction could not proceed without binding mitigation measures. He had asked that a substantial portion of any royalties be ring-fenced for the care of Jenna and the animals. These were not details left to interpretation. They were directives with legal teeth. We talked through the options. I could have reacted with fury or with a quick concession to quiet the town. Instead, I chose to be precise. "I'm not going to sell the horses to stop people from yelling," I told them, which felt both literal and symbolic. But I am willing to discuss a structure that honors the stewardship clauses Joshua insisted upon, with transparency and oversight. We can bring in an independent trustee to ensure the land and the life it supports are preserved. Alan, for all his sharpness, liked the idea of a structure. Lawyers love structures because they make conflict legible.
He suggested a mediator. Robert wanted to speak to anyone who would command attention. David looked at the floor and then at Jenna, who had drawn the mayor's eyes so perfectly it hurt. In that small, beating silence, something shifted. The brothers' performance met a framework and found it less fun than they'd imagined.
The cameras, of course, recorded the negotiation. Grainy shots of Alan's tie and Robert's clenched jaw would populate social feeds overnight. The meeting did not explode into violence. It landed into negotiation. Less cinematic, perhaps, but effective. The men left under the watchful lens of the porch camera, their tempers intact, but their threats tempered by the presence of witnesses and documents that made wild claims harder to sustain. What happened next, in the space between the departure and the dawn, was the quiet work of turning documents into a coherent pathway. I wrote a list of next steps, some of which were painfully mundane: securing the chain of custody for the maps, making sure the bunker remained under lock, identifying the trustee who would accept oversight responsibilities, and arranging the environmental covenants that would make any future extraction conditional. There was also the nighttime work of consoling Jenna, who had been tugged by a dozen voices trying to tell her how to mourn and how to act. We went to the stables. The air was sharp and cold and smelled of straw and horse breath. Lark nudged Jenna's shoulder and exhaled as if to say everything will move at the pace of living things. We stood there, arms around each other, and let the animals keep watch. The mare, patient and warm, understood something about constancy that conversation did not. Then there was the unexpected: public attention. Reporters wanted statements. A local TV crew requested an interview. Some nights the house felt like a stage on which the story played out. But there was a strange virtue to attention when it focused on the right things. We used it to tell the truth we could substantiate, that Joshua had planned, that there were documents that suggested potential resources, and that any money would be tied to stewardship clauses meant to protect the land and its creatures. Over the ensuing weeks, a pattern emerged. Dribs of footage leaked, clamorous commentary surfed across town, and an ethics conversation unfolded in kitchen chairs and over coffee from neighbors. People took sides, and a few who had been neutral found their moral compasses nudged by the clarity of the documents. Through it all, I kept to Joshua's plan, and to Ellis, who became my bulwark. He was not showy or theatrical. He was a man who knew how to mend broken fences and how to keep a mare quiet at night when storms came. He knew how to summon a calm that diffused conflict by not participating in it. At one point, Alan took the matter to an attorney who made a tactical misstep. He publicly magnified the ambiguity argument, ignoring the clauses Joshua had insisted upon. That attorney, an emissary of combative will, found himself facing not only paperwork, but an expert panel who could explain the logic behind the clauses, how they bound any buyer or developer to measurable environmental outcomes. Once you create a measurable limit, phased extraction, baselined water tables, a fund for remediation, then litigation becomes less about the morality of the decision and more about how to meet those closed contractual obligations. It was an unromantic but effective way to close off opportunism. Another corner of the story involved the idea of billions. The tabloids loved the rumor because it fit the pattern of quick and shiny headlines. I found myself repeating the same phrase often. The value is projected, not certain. Estimates are contingent on geological extraction that would require significant work and would only produce any money if, and only if, companies in the oversight group agreed on mitigations. Dr. Hale called it a distant possibility, not a purchase price, which is not the kind of flourish that sells newspapers, but it is the kind of truth that keeps the ground underneath a farm intact. And then there was the moment captured on tape that would become the hinge of our settlement. The brothers had been public in their opposition. They were also public in their private impatience. Late one evening, a local neighbor's ring camera recorded them near the trapdoor to the bunker. They were not violent, but they were clearly trying to gain access, or at least to demonstrate they could. Robert's voice, when slowed, was almost theatrical. "If there's anything worth protecting," he muttered to Alan, "we'll have to show the town we can protect it better than she can." That clip leaked in the worst way, suffused with thin intentions and the kind of bad optics that do a legal strategy no favors. The presence of their physical attempt to access the bunker without lawful authority made their subsequent courtroom posture less credible. It was not criminal in the way the tabloids wanted to make it. It was a private, small escalation. But the optics, recorded on someone's motion-activated camera, were telling. It made the brothers look like men more interested in possession than preservation. When the mediator finally convened us for a formal settlement discussion, the air was a taut string. I remember walking to the table with Joshua's envelope in my hand like an amulet. The mediator sat in the middle, impartial and slightly buffeted by the social storm. The lawyers arranged their documents like chess pieces. Robert came with the swagger of someone still convinced of his moral right. Alan with refinement and a list of contingencies. David with a paper he had barely read. Ellis stood at the edge, an unassuming presence who looked after the horses as if they too were sitting in the room with us. I laid out what I would accept. The trust, I said, would have a clear mandate: stewardship of the land, transparent oversight by independent trustees, enforceable environmental protections, and a fund specifically committed to the animals and to Jenna's education and well-being. Any extraction agreement would require a phased approach, publicly available baselines on water and air quality, and a revenue allocation that reserved a portion to support long-term land care. I proposed an independent audit process, and I asked for a clause that required mediation in the event of future disputes, not immediate litigation. Alan countered with numbers and with technicalities designed to leave room for later negotiation. Robert wanted immediate influence. His face had the look of a man who thought the world owed him quick results. David, finally, surprised me by asking about the horses. His tone was soft. There was a thread of guilt in it. He asked if they could keep a mare for memory's sake. I thought of small reconciliations. I thought of how a person's remorse might be the beginning of repair. The conversation wandered and ricocheted, but the turning point came when Dr. Hale presented a concise summary. The survey suggested a potential worth that would be substantial if the resource were extractable on a commercial scale, but commercial extraction without proper mitigation would be destructive and likely to provoke legal and environmental pushback that could make any operation unviable. In short, the prudent approach, what Joshua had insisted upon, was not an obstruction to productivity. It was a strategy to ensure any wealth derived would be durable and ethical. Alan had been betting the argument that greed and speed could win the day. But the combination of evidence, presence of witnesses, and the public clips that showed attempts at private access made his leverage less absolute. He realized, with the slow arithmetic of a man who counts lawyers' fees, that an expensive fight risked producing nothing if the public and regulatory climate refused to allow a careless extraction. So they settled, not a dramatic victory, not a courtroom vindication with gavel and flourish, but a practical set of terms that preserved Joshua's stipulations. There would be a trust. Ellis would be named as the manager with clear oversight. A substantial portion of revenue, if revenue materialized, would be ring-fenced for the animals and for Jenna's education. Extraction would be conditional on phased, tightly monitored operations with independent environmental oversight. The brothers accepted the mediated settlement, more because the costs of continued contest looked steeper than the uneasy compromise than because of any emotional reform. The cameras recorded the signatures and the handshake,
The brothers' faces smoothed into the weary alignments of people who had calculated their loss and decided it was acceptable. The footage, unedited, time-stamped, and grainy in parts, was crucial. It would later be used to demonstrate the public manner in which the negotiations had occurred. It was, in a strange way, the most honest archive of the event. There were costs. The settlement did not feel like victory in the sense of triumph.
It felt like a decision made in the interest of the land, of Jenna, and of the horses. It felt like the kind of victory Joshua would have wanted, sober, careful, and protective. There was no gloating. There was quiet. The brothers left with their grievances intact, but with legal responsibilities that bound them to a system that limited the kind of freewheeling plunder they had imagined. After the signatures were dry, after lawyers exchanged tone-polished words about next steps and outside counsel, I walked to the barn alone. Ellis followed at a respectful distance. The trapdoor to the bunker looked harmless and sacred. I sat on a bale and unfolded the sealed letter again, feeling Joshua's script like a weather map. On the bench under the tack hooks was a small painting he'd left, half-finished, a study of a mare's eye reflecting a horizon. I touched the frame and felt the quiet endurance of someone who had planned as if tenderness were a strategy. Jenna stood beside me in the dusk, hair wind-tossed. She held a small piece of paper, notes for a grant she wanted to apply for that would support the arts program she dreamed of creating for local children. The settlement had allowed for the possibility of such things, fulfilled not with a single windfall, but with the slow accrual that responsible revenue might provide. I could see, in the blush on her face, a woman being birthed out of a child's skin. We sat there for a long moment, the horses shifting in the paddock like a living clock. "Do you think he knew how dirty people could be?" Jenna asked finally. "He knew some of the dirt," I said. "He also knew how to prepare for rain." There was an afterlife to the battle that took the form of restoration rather than revenge. We ran the trust with meetings scheduled and an independent trustee who had the steadiness Joshua wanted. The environmental covenants were signed in stone, legal, yes, but also a kind of promise, carried in language that required monitoring and transparent reporting. Ellis managed the day-to-day with the elbow grease of someone who values the small rituals, feeding, mending, noticing when a mare's wry leg told a story. In the months that followed, I found that freedom is not only about money or the absence of conflict. It's a permission to live that includes the messy human things, like painting a thing simply because you need to paint it, not to win a court case. I returned to the canvases with a patience that surprised me. One of the major works I finished that winter was a triptych of the farm. Left panel Dawn, center panel the mare, right panel the dining room with a brass key on the table. The painting was not a claim, it was a memory made visible. There were still shards of public attention from time to time, a commentator here, a social post there. Someone would call the trust to ask where the money was going. We were transparent, our accounting was public and audited. Hale volunteered to oversee the environmental sampling program, which felt like a gift. The fund for the horses took the shape of a stable endowment that ensured veterinary care and care for retirees who had worked on the farm. Jenna used part of a grant to kickstart her art outreach program and taught a small class of children to draw a horse's leg until they understood why patience mattered. And there were private moments that mattered more than any public resolution. Once, on a winter evening, I found a new video Joshua had labeled in handwriting I recognized, Brevity. It was short, taken with the same domestic camera he had used in his other tapes. He looked older than the man in the first videos, but not diminished. He smiled with the sort of tired peace you see in people who have made peace with their own unfinished sentences. "If you ever get to this one," he said, voice soft, "and you've already had to sign things and argue, remember this. Stewardship is not a ledger. It is a way of speaking to the land. Talk to it as if someone you loved was listening." He paused and chuckled. "Tell them I never wanted spectacle. I wanted the horses to have hay and the child to have choices. If a person near the barn seems to deserve more than a name at the bottom of a deed, trust that. Sometimes hands mean more than paper. He looked away and then back at the camera. If all you do is maintain the fences and keep paint on the boards, you'll have done what matters. And if you paint, paint as if the world is going to pay attention. It will in its own way. When the video ended, I let myself cry, not the ragged, furious kind I had known in the funeral parlor, but a cleaner, salt and soothing grief that felt like rain watering a garden. Jenna put her head on my shoulder and thumped a small hand against my ribs in a way that said, in child language, "We are all right." There were moments of reconciliation, too. David reached out weeks after the settlement and asked if he could volunteer at the farm. He wanted to learn to mend fences and feed grain and be useful in a way that did not demand ownership. It was not an apology written capital letters, but it was a start. We let him help, at first under Ellis's watch and then on his own, and those small acts became a road to something less brittle. Robert and Alan, for their part, took their money and their bruises into a town that loves a comeback story. Their public anger cooled into a quieter, more private negotiation with their sense of entitlement. It is not my job to predict who becomes better. I can only say that the trust ensured they could not take without reason. It created a perimeter that required thoughtfulness. One winter afternoon, I stood in the studio and put one last stroke on the triptych. The painting had become a prayer and a ledger at once. Before I stretched it out for display, I took a photograph and sent it, as Joshua would have liked, to a few people who had been part of the process. I knew he preferred small audiences. The world need not be a stage for what the farm was. The last video he left, One More Epistle, came with a line that felt more like benediction than instruction. He sat in the studio, hands folded on his knees, the light like a shawl across his shoulders. "I wanted to give you a life without constant bargaining," he said. "I didn't think of it as leaving billions or giving a fortune. I thought of it as creating a bedrock. Anything else is what people call noise." He paused, then smiled in the way that broke my heart with tenderness. "If anyone ever calls Ellis the Maid," he said, wry and tender, "tell them it was our shorthand for someone who keeps a household in truth. Tell them it takes courage to love the ordinary. That's all I wanted, ordinary courage." I turned the laptop off, feeling the small weight of his last voice settle in the house like residue. Outside, the horses grazed, indifferent and noble. The trust was in place, the covenant signed, the audit scheduled. The barn smelled where it always had, straw and earth, and the trapdoor to the bunker felt less ominous now than it had when we first discovered it. It contained a man's careful, humane logic, not a key to a sensational headline. At the end of the long day, Jenna and I walked out to the fence line. The sky was a bruised blue-pink. We leaned on the rail and watched Lark stamp her foot and toss her mane. "Do you ever regret not telling him everything?" Jenna asked, the question folding open like a small paper boat. "No," I said honestly. "He told us what he thought would save us from the worst of people's greed. He left us more than numbers. He left us a way to protect what mattered." She nodded, and her hand found mine. In that simple human contact, I felt the arc Joshua had intended bend towards something like peace. The cameras had caught the brothers' tones, their small attempts, and their faces when they tried to make entitlement into legitimacy. Those recordings had been useful, not as vehicles for humiliation, but as evidence that allowed the community to understand a truth. That stewardship takes work and that love can be planned. We ended the day in the studio. I set my brush down and looked at the triptych. The right panel, our small table with the brass key and the painting, felt like an altar for decisions made with tenderness rather than spectacle. I clicked the laptop on,
and found, tucked between the other videos, a short file Joshua had labeled simply "for later." He looked straight into the lens. "If anyone ever says I left billions to a maid," he said, and I could hear the ghost of a smile, "they're simplifying the story. I left responsibility to someone who knew how to hold it. I left you the right to wake up to the sound of horses and to the work of keeping a place alive. That, in my mind, is worth more than a headline." When the video ended, I sat in the low light and felt the arc close as gently as a door.
The public would have its stories. The tabloids would have their temptations. There would be whispers and small resentments and the peculiar hunger of a world always looking for a simple villain. But in the house and the field and the trust-bound pages, something quieter had been preserved. A place where animals were fed, where a child could learn to draw, and where the decisions about land were made with the kind of caution that thinks of the future as more than a bank statement. If you've wondered where you would stand in a case like this, caught between family claims, loyalty, and the soil under your feet, I would tell you what I tell myself when I pick up a brush. There is an ethic in tending. Choose the work of tending when you can. It will take you through the noise. If this story moved you, or if you know someone who would understand the idea of stewardship better than spectacle, share it. Tell us in the comments. Would you keep the land or would you sell it to stop the shouting? And if you're new here, consider subscribing so we can sit with more stories like this. People who inherit things that are more responsibility than reward and who find dignity in protecting them. Later, when the public's appetite for the sensational waned and the trust settled into the slow routine of account statements and stewardship reports, I returned to the painting on a quiet morning. I signed the lower corner with the same hand that had once fumbled a letter clasped in a funeral parlor. It felt less like an act of completion than like a promise renewed. The tapes remained archived, Joshua's voice a map in the laptop for Jenna and for me, and for anyone the trust felt needed to understand how and why the decisions had been set. Ellis continued to do what he always had. Keep the fences mended, the water troughs full, the horses quiet and content. He did not broadcast his authority. He exercised it in the patient, quotidian acts that sustain life. Sometimes, in the hush of late afternoon, I would catch the grainy footage of the brothers on the porch and think of how public records and private kindness can conspire to make consequence align with conscience. Sometimes they apologized in small ways. Sometimes they did not. There is no neat moral in people's behavior, but there was a perimeter of law and of public record that made predatory ambition less efficient. The cameras caught it, the documents proved it, and the trust enforced it. In the end, what had been billions in the mouths of strangers became for us potential, a possibility to pay staff, to secure veterinary care in perpetuity, to fund the education programs Jenna loved, to ensure that any extraction would occur under the strictest protections. It could have been a story of fortune turned spectacle. Instead, it was a story of stewardship, of a man who used his last years to wedge protective mechanisms into the fabric of a place he loved, and a woman who had to learn to speak for him when he could no longer speak for himself. Joshua's last line on the final tape was simple and quiet, and it felt like a benediction. "Live with the animals close," he said. "Keep paint on the walls. Protect the child. That is more than most people get to do." Then he smiled, as if pleased that his small domestic liturgy had been understood. I shut the laptop, the house settling, and walked out to the field with Jenna at my side. The horses greeted us as if no scandal had ever touched us, pure creaturely beings who live by the rhythm of feeding and rest. In their presence, the world's noisy claims seemed to thin into something manageable. We put the brass key back in the drawer where it belonged. It was not a key to fortune, but a key to a life. The insistence that someone, somewhere, had chosen the quiet work of stewardship over the spectacle of wealth. That, after all, was Joshua's wish. That was the legacy we chose to honor.